What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be talking about the death metal band Aborted. Aborted were formed in 1995 by vocalist and Soul Constant member Sven de Calloway. While they've kind of become known for more of their deathgrind sound, they actually started off as a bit more of a brutal death metal band on their 1999 debut, The Purity of Perversion. On this album, I definitely hear a lot of early Dying Fetus, particularly the Purification Through Violence album, as well as other brutal death metal bands. Regurgitation is another name that comes to mind. And that's apparent right from some of the earlier tracks on the album, like Lament Configuration, which just has this huge, chuggy, and slammy riff that I just love. Wrenched Carnal Ornaments, which is the closing track, is another really cool song. It's got this slow and dominant riff that sounds a lot like what you'd hear on Dying Fetus's Purification Through Violence album. I also love how the samples right at the end are kind of overlaid with the music. It makes for kind of a cinematic closing that I really like. The guitar work on here, even aside from those moments, is pretty good. The guitars are pretty hooky, surprisingly varied, and they just have this manic feel to them, like you're inside the mind of a serial killer. The Sanctification of Fornication in particular just has these wild and gyrating tremolos that I really like. Necroeroticism and Highway I-35 are also really cool with these kind of perverted sounding melodic riffs. Vocally, Sven does a great job here. Even this early in his career, he's still a very varied vocalist with a lot of sewer monster, deeper vocals, but then also some kind of throatier vocals as well, and some pretty hooky vocal lines too, particularly on the track Act of Supremacy. It's definitely unique compared to other brutal death metal vocalists, and I think kind of established him as an interesting vocalist right from the get-go to me. The production on here is just absolutely disgusting. It sounds rancid and filthy. I just want to take a bath every time I listen to this album. The samples also add to that nasty feel too. Right at the start of the album, you have a sample of what sounds like a deviant autopsy, complete with a bone saw sawing into a body right at the end. This is overall an interesting album. It's kind of Aborted's forgotten album, I would say. It's not on Spotify. It hasn't been pressed physically since 2000, and the band haven't played anything from it live since 2006. But I'd say it's actually a bit underrated. It's a brutal album, it's a nasty album, but it's got some really great riffs that are surprisingly memorable. It's also really short. It doesn't overstay its welcome at only 31 minutes long. This is a great start to their career, I think, and while this brutal death metal sound isn't usually what I would come to Aborted for, I think they do it really well here. I think if this was the only album Aborted ever did, it kind of would be considered a brutal death metal gem, but it has, I think, been overshadowed a bit by what Aborted would do later. So, yeah, really good album. I'll put it right in the middle of their discography because I do think they have much better stuff. But as we will discuss, there's also some stuff that I definitely don't enjoy as much. All right, so that brings us to 2001 with the album Engineering the Dead. So this was definitely a bit more of a high-profile release, at least that's how it seems in retrospect, and definitely a bit of a step forward for the band. The production is a little bit cleaner, but it still sounds nasty. The brutal death metal sound is definitely still prominent here, but it's getting a little bit closer to modern Aborted with some more blast beats, particularly on the song To Roast and Grind, which is an awesome track with these revving chainsaw riffs and just pummeling drums that just beat you into submission. There's also a lot of really great standout tracks here, even more so than the last album. Nailed Through Her C-Word is one of the band's catchiest songs. The melodies on there are just super catchy, but they also sound like you're just getting your skin flayed off. And the guitars just have this almost playful touch to them. It's a really interesting song. I like the title track a lot too. It's got these really bizarre yet catchy tremolo riffs and kind of these strained notes during what I guess I would call the chorus. The opening track, The Holocaust Incarnate, is also really cool, just these rush of demented riffs. And then later tracks kind of have some slammy riffs that you would hear on the first album as well. Yeah, I find a couple of the songs here a lot more memorable than the debut, but I also think this album is kind of front-loaded. It is very close to the Purity Perversion for me, and it's very tough to rate because of that. I will say the highs here are higher. The songs I like here, I like more than anything from the Purity Perversion, so because of that, I'll rank this higher than the Purity Perversion, but these albums are very close to me. I should also mention too, because of the number of albums in the band's catalog, I had to put more than one album on each tier, so the leftmost album will be the highest one in each tier, as I guess is typical for a lot of tier rankings. Alright, so that brings us to 2003 with the album Gormageddon. I would say this is generally regarded as the band's best album, and I have to agree. This album is, to me, fantastic. This represents their shift to more of a death grind sound, which is the sound they become better known for today. But the way they pull it off is just excellent. Very great execution here. The production here is just absolutely bludgeoning. Listening to this is just like getting overwhelmed with this sense of just raw force. Yet at the same time, there's a lot of nuances and a lot of catchy hooks here too that remain audible and still come through despite that brutality. This to me is just that rare album that really balances the brutality with the catchiness. I think you hear that right from the start with the song Meticulous Invagination, which is one of my favorite Aborted songs. You have just a rush of grindcore riffs throughout the song, culminating in this super melodic solo that was one of my favorite things ever in high school. Yeah. The title track is also really cool with some nice groovy riffs to it. Ornaments of Derision has these like rocking chords that almost make for a chorus, I guess. It's pretty cool. I also like the ending sample in that song where the sample just goes, "The soul should not enter the subdural space," and then you just explode right into sanguine verses of extirpation, which is another really cool song that is just a grindcore beatdown, complete with a really cool breakdown in it too. Yeah, the only real issue I have with this album is there's a string of songs in the second half that all sound fairly similar to each other, but I think the band make up for that with a really strong ending. The second to last track, Sea of Cartilage, has an interesting break in it where you have samples of the serial killer Joseph Callinger talking about how he wants to murder everyone and become God, combined with some really just menacing guitars. And then the closing track, Nemesis, I think is really cool. Just this beat down section that has some flailing notes. It makes for a really cool closer. Sven here sounds utterly demented. He's got some great highs, great lows, just overall a great performance. Overall, everything just comes together perfectly here to me. This is just a great all-around album. One of my favorite extreme metal albums of all time. I first heard it in high school, and it has continued to be something I revisit frequently. It's a cohesive package. It's well-sequenced. It's a pretty short album. And again, just the way it balances that brutality with the hooks is something you don't often hear. This, to me, goes right to the top. All right, so that brings us to 2005 with the album The Archaic Abattoir. So this was kind of the beginning of, I guess, a little bit of a dark period for the band. Starting with this album, the next few albums, I would say, generally had less positive reception, especially in the metal community. And this was an interesting approach, I would say, after Gormageddon. Even though they had pretty much the same lineup as they did on Gormageddon, they took a bit of a different approach with this album. It almost feels like a little bit more of a hardcore or metalcore feel at times, and definitely a much groovier album overall. Dead Reckoning shows that right from the start, which has a breakdown that you could honestly slap on a metalcore album without batting an eyelash. It is really cool the way they do it, though, with some samples from American Psycho worked in, and I love Sven's line here where he just goes, "Who am I? What push comes to shove?" Very brutal, very cool. You know, I love Aborted most for the death grind sound that you hear on Gormageddon and their later albums, but I think the sound here is pretty engaging as well. Blood Fixing the Bled is really cool, which mixes kind of these really fat meathead grooves with some kind of more melodic riffs that you might hear in a Carcass song. Hecatomb is another cool song, and A Cold Logistic Slaughter is also really cool, which is a bit of a shorter track. I definitely do have some issues with this album. The songwriting feels a little more riff salad-esque. It's definitely less distinct than their previous albums. There's just a lot of big, bulky, groovy riffs, but they're not always particularly notable. I feel like by the end of the album, I've kind of just heard like everything the album has to offer, and I'm not really that impressed with the grooves anymore. But I will say some of the later songs do kind of redeem things a little bit with some really good solos, particularly Descent to Extirpation. Sven, again, sounds like an absolute animal here, as always. They still play songs from this album live pretty frequently. I think the band are pretty proud of it, and I can see why. This isn't necessarily the sound I come to Aborted for, but at the same time, I think it's good at what it does. It's a very groovy album, kind of homogenous, but nonetheless, not an album you need to think too much about, just one you kind of throw on and enjoy for what it is. It's kind of a cool, I guess, gym music album, or even a cool starter album for someone who, you know, isn't maybe necessarily into death grind or death metal, but wants to hear what Aborted is generally about. Doesn't quite work as well as their other stuff, so because of that, I'll definitely rank it lower than their other albums, but not a bad album overall. All right, so that brings us to 2007 with the album Slaughter and Apparatus, a Methodical Overture. They had an entirely new lineup for this one, other than Sven. Stylistically, kind of similar to the last album, a little less groovy, also less interesting riffs, but still some of those kind of hardcore / metalcore flirtations. That being said, this album is definitely my least favorite in their catalog. The production here is just crushed. It's very compressed, very loud, just not engaging at all. The songs here also just don't really do much for me whatsoever. A Methodical Overture just kind of sounds like a worse retread of the last album. Avenius tries to stand out with these like wailing notes during the chorus, but it just annoys me. It's not for me. Sven seems to use a lot more of his higher register vocals on this album, and for some reason they don't really sound as good to me. It might be a production thing, but yeah, it doesn't work for me. This album to me is really just kind of in one ear and out the other. You know, every time I listen to it, it's just hard for me to even stay engaged just because I don't find the music engaging and I find the production just kind of annoying. The opening track, the Conjuring Enigma, is okay. It opens with some cool samples and it's got some catchy vocal lines, but that's really the only positive thing I have to say. This album just does nothing for me. I didn't like it when it came out in 2007, and it's never really grown on me. It's never really clicked with me, no matter how many times I've gone back to it. This is the only Aborted album I would say I actually dislike, and because of that, this goes at the bottom for me. Fortunately, it would only go up from here, but it would take a little time before we start going up because the next album was Strychnine 213 in 2008. I almost wonder if the band themselves were also not happy with the approach they took on Slaughter and Apparatus, because Strychnine 213 kind of represents a bit more of a shift back to the death metal sound that you heard in the early years, albeit still with some melodic ideas implemented. While that sounds good on paper, though, it definitely didn't entirely work. I feel comfortable saying this is probably the most hated Aborted album, and I definitely understand why. The production here just really lacks intensity. Sven just sounds raspy and dry, doesn't really have much power to his vocals. The guitars likewise just sound dry and a little weak. It's a very weird sounding album that isn't particularly heavy. But, you know, that being said, I think this album actually does get more hate than it deserves. That production kind of has grown on me over the years. There's something about the production that just makes this album sound extra repulsive and disgusting. It's got this sick atmosphere that just never goes away. And there actually are some surprisingly good songs on here. The opening, I guess, instrumental Carry On is really cool. It's got this melody of just impending doom, like the sound of a video game character approaching the final boss. O Viola Tree on a Hematite Platter is another really cool song. It's a little bit long, but this song is great. It's got some of the catchiest riffs in the band's catalog. I love the vocal lines here, too. I-35 also has some cool vocal lines and kind of some neat rocking riffs. One of the guitarists also contributed vocals to this album, which is cool. It adds a little bit of variety on the vocal front. You know, that being said, this album definitely isn't loaded with impressive moments. There are a lot of songs here that are pretty bland and forgettable. Sven talked in interviews about how the band was in a bad place at the time, and he's not very happy with this album. It definitely doesn't seem like a very inspired album, but I can definitely understand why it's regarded as one of their weaker albums. I also think it's one of their weaker albums, but unlike their last album, I find this one at least listenable from front to back. So because of that, I will put it higher than Slaughter and Apparatus, but still definitely one of their weaker efforts overall. All right, so that brings us to 2012 with the album Global Flatline. To me, this really represented Aborted's rebirth and the start of the Aborted we know today. This album to me just really felt like a nice reset for the band, and really the reset they needed after two pretty weak albums. Most notably, drummer Ken Badine debuted on this album. He sounds like an absolute machine of a drummer. I think he played a big part in crafting Aborted's super tight sound that they have developed over the course of their last few albums, and it all really started here. He's super tight, he's super fast, and it's turned Aborted into the band they are today. The production here is really heavy, really nasty. The guitars just roar with power. It just feels like a total 180 from Strychnine 213. It's also, I would say, one of, if not the most cohesive album in the band's catalog. And it's packed with killer songs that are probably sequenced better than anything else in the band's catalog. The title track is an amazing song. It opens with these really slow, doomy chords before this sample cuts in that just says, "I'm gonna fucking rape your soul." And then just a deathgrind shitstorm just kicks in. It's amazing. The Origin of Disease is another really cool song. It's got these frantic notes that just dart all over the fretboard, and then a quick squirming but really heavy groove that I just love. There's also more variety here, too. The songs just kind of have their own identity. Coronary Reconstruction has some really fat grooves that kind of call back to the archaic Abitur. Fecal Forgery has a really catchy tremolo line. Then you have Expurgation Euphoria, which is kind of the atmospheric, slower track later in the album that I think does a really good job providing a little bit of a break from all the bludgeoning. The later songs here aren't as good, I would say, as the earlier ones, but there still are some really cool later cuts. I like Grime and the song Our Father Who Art of Feces. The closing track End Still is also really cool. I've never found that Aborted's closing songs are particularly notable, but this one I would say is definitely an exception. It's got a slower pace and some fantastic soloing, and I also love the way it closes with a sample of a heart flatlining. It's very fitting for the album. Yeah, the only real issue I have with this album is that it's a little long. Other than that, I think this is something really, really special. This to me just represented that kind of lightning in a bottle moment late in the band's career and is very close to Gormageddon in terms of quality. I would still put Gormageddon slightly higher because I think Global Flatline is just a little bit long. I think maybe cutting a song or two might have helped, but yeah, overall, another fantastic effort and one of my favorite Aborted albums. All right, so that brings us to 2014 with the album The Necrotic Manifesto. So this kind of continues the momentum from the last album, even though they have a new set of guitarists. The sound is pretty similar. Maybe a bit cleaner here in terms of the production, but still some good songs here. The Extirpation Agenda is a pretty cool song. It kicks the door in with some great slamming grooves. The title track has some more melodic riffs and just some devastating breakdowns. Chronicles of Detruncation has always been a favorite of mine. It's got a super blunt riff that just feels like a cinder block just getting slammed in your face. Again, there's also some cool variety here too. Your Entitlement Means Nothing is a short blaster with a great and very fitting sample from the movie Hobo with a Shotgun. Another slower track later in the runtime provides a little bit of diversity, which is good. And then Cenobites is kind of a cool closer. But yeah, overall, the songwriting here is maybe just a little denser than the last album. The songs just feel packed with riffs, particularly tracks like the Davidian Deceit, where there's just a lot going on. Personally, when the songs are this dense, it just feels like there's not as much to pull you in, there's not as many hooks. And there's other quibbles I have with this album too. I don't really like the way it reuses some of the samples from previous albums. That might not be as bad as reusing a riff, but it still just feels a little bit lazy to me. This album also just feels long to me. It's only one track longer than Global Flatline, but it feels a lot longer, and maybe that's partially due to just how dense the songs are, but I feel like cutting out a track or two, especially in the second half of the album, might have helped this thing be a better project overall. Some of the tracks don't have as unique an identity either, and the production just feels a little bit more overbearing than Global Flatline as well. It's definitely not a bad album. I enjoy it, I love it, but yeah, compared to Global Flatline, definitely a bit of a step down. This is a really tough one to rank for me because it's about equal to The Purity Perversion and Engineering the Dead, which I already thought were really close. But if I had to put it anywhere, I would probably put it just below Purity Perversion, but very, very close in terms of quality. All right, so that brings us to 2016 with the album Retrogore. So similar approach with the last album. This one's maybe a bit cleaner, a little more technical, and another really enjoyable deathgrind album. My biggest issue with this album is that it's just a little front-loaded to me. I really love the first half of this album, and if they had taken the first 5 or 6 songs and just made an EP out of them, it would have been one of my favorite things the band has ever released. Retrogore is a real cool first proper track. It's got these jarring chords that make for a really neat chorus. Cadaverous Banquet is another really cool song. It's got a really melodic riff that kind of reminds me of The Origin of Disease, and it almost sounds like a bit of a tech death song at times. Hormageddon is another really cool song. I love the chorus in this track. Termination Redux has a really neat guitar lick and just a skull-shattering breakdown. And, while I love all those tracks, and the second half of the album is still good, to me, I just love the first half of this album so much that it feels just very unbalanced to me. Divine Impediment seems to be a song that a lot of people like, but to me, it's just never really clicked much. I've never really found it a terribly interesting track. Forged for Decrepitude is likewise just one of many songs in the second half that I enjoy when I'm listening to them, but I honestly could not tell you what a note of that song sounds like. Stylistically, I love the modern deathgrind sound that they're going with. I think this is really well executed. I think this is really well done. Unlike the Necrotic Manifesto, it doesn't reuse samples, so that's definitely a plus. But just because of how much I enjoy the first half of this album compared to the second half, it's tough for me to rank this above the Necrotic Manifesto. I still think it's better than the Archaic Abattoir. But yeah, not by a whole lot. All right, so that brings us to 2018 with the album Terror Vision. So Sven talked a lot about how they took more time to craft the songs in this album, and this is actually a case where I think that might have been to the album's detriment. A lot of the songs here just feel a little too packed for me. There's melodic riffs, there's kind of black metal riffs, guest vocal spots, atmospheric intros, some technical riffing. It all just comes together and is just thrown at you, and it's just overwhelming to me. There's not necessarily a whole lot of direct songwriting here, not really a whole lot of hooks. And even when there is a good idea, like the groovy riff that opens up the song Deep Red, it feels like the band just immediately move on into other ideas that I don't think are as interesting. I think it would have been a much stronger album if the band had focused in on what their strongest riffs were and wrote the songs around those riffs, as opposed to what sounds like just trying to throw as many cool ideas into each song as possible. The production here is also really loud and boisterous. It just kind of makes for a bit of an obnoxious listen to me. I also think the 45-minute runtime doesn't do it any favors. This is one of Aborted's longest albums, and combined with that dense songwriting and the kind of loud production, this is definitely not a favorite of mine. That being said, there are some tracks I do like here. The song Terror Vision is pretty cool. It's got some real dramatic riffs. Vespertine Decay has some melodic ideas that I really like. And then Squalor Opera is probably not only my favorite song on this album, but probably one of my favorite Aborted songs overall. It's got an awesome chorus to it that just begs for you to bang your head, and then some really cool rhythmic shifts that just make for some really killer grooves. Yeah, a lot of people do seem to like this album, and I guess I can understand why, but this album has just never clicked with me. I even had the opportunity to see them play it live in full on 70,000 Tons of Metal a few years ago, and even despite that, it just never really clicked for me. You know, I definitely like it more than Strychnine 213 and Slaughter and Apparatus, but I would rather honestly listen to the Archaic Abattoir than this album, so I will put that here. Not a bad album, just not something I enjoy as much as their other works. All right, so that brings us to 2021 with their latest album, Maniacult. So before this album came out, I was a little concerned with how it was going to sound. They were down to only one guitarist with this album, Ian Jekalis, formerly of Abigail Williams. And from what I understand, he pretty much wrote this entire album. So I was curious if it was going to be one of those albums that stylistically is pretty homogenous, and I'm happy to say it wasn't. This is actually a really excellent album with a lot of diversity. The first proper track, Maniacult, has a cool Dying Fetus style riff. Portal to Vacuity has some juggling chainsaw chords that don't really sound a whole lot like anything else on the album. Dementophobia has some Modern Carcass vibes and some thrashy ideas that also don't sound a whole lot like anything else on the album. And then having a creepy interlude midway through, I think, really works. That interlude also marks the beginning of what I would say is my favorite sequence on the album, or almost on any Aborted album. Ceremonial Ineptitude is just an amazing song. I love these huge chugs that are worked really cohesively into some black metal ideas, along with some gang vocals, which I can't recall ever hearing in Aborted before, but they work so well here. And it's just all incorporated in a way that makes sense. Drag Me to Hell is the following track, and that's another amazing song that is one of my favorite Aborted songs. It does a really good job kind of balancing some more immediate riffing and immediate ideas with some more epic moments. Grotesque is another really cool song. It's got some more melodic death metal riffs and a really cinematic closing with these great leads. There are a couple songwriting quibbles I have with this album. The title track and Portal to Vacuity have some slow portions that kind of abruptly just appear. And there's a couple songs I don't necessarily love as much. I think the closing track isn't the greatest thing the band has ever done. And Impetus Odi is a fine song, but I've just never really been a big fan of it. But yeah, that being said, I think this is a terrific album overall. Honestly, one of my favorites that Aborted has ever done. This album to me just has a lot of cool ideas. It really nails their deathgrind sound. It's well sequenced, it's varied. It's just a joy to listen to from front to back. I honestly like this more than Engineering the Dead. And because of that, I'll have to put this here. And I will move up Engineering the Dead. Yeah, overall, Aborted are an amazing band. I love the fact that they've been around since 1995, over 25 years now, and yet it still feels to me like they're just now hitting their stride. They just got signed to Nuclear Blast a few weeks back, just released a single that I find amazing, and I'm so excited to see where the band go from here. They found a sound that works for them. People love them. Their merch game is on point. Their live show is on point. This is a band that's just doing everything right in 2022, and I'm so excited for what they do next. But that does it for this video, guys. Let me know what you think of Aborted in the comments. Let me know how you would rank their albums. And if you like this video, please subscribe, please drop me a like, and I'll see you guys next time. Stay heavy.